The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire. Holmes carefully read a note that had arrived in the last post. Then, with a little chuckle, he tossed it over to me. "This is quite a mix, Watson," he said. "A bit modern, a bit old-fashioned, practical, and completely crazy. What do you make of it?" I read the note. 46, Old Jury, Nover 19th, Re-Vampires, Sir. Our client, Mr. Robert Ferguson of Ferguson and Muirhead, tea brokers of Mincing Lane, has asked us about vampires. We only deal with machines, so we've told him to talk to you. Remember that time you helped with the Matilda Briggs case? We are, sir. Faithfully yours, Morrison, and Dodd, per EJC. Matilda Briggs wasn't a young lady, Watson, Holmes said, thinking back. It was a ship connected to the giant rat of Sumatra, a story the world isn't ready for yet. But vampires? Does that come under our work? Anything is better than doing nothing, but this feels like a fairy tale. Check what our V section has to say, Watson. I leaned back and grabbed the big book of cases and information. Holmes balanced it on his knee and scanned it carefully. Voyage of the Gloria Scott, he read. That was a bad one. I think you wrote about it, Watson, even though it didn't go well. Victor Lynch, the forger, venomous lizard, interesting case. Vittoria, the circus girl, Vanderbilt and the thief, vipers, Vigor, the strong man. Aha! Look here, Watson, vampires in Hungary. And again, vampires in Transylvania. He flipped through the pages excitedly, but then slammed the book shut with a sigh. Nonsense, Watson. Complete nonsense. What have we to do with dead people who can only be stopped by putting a stake through their heart? It's crazy. But, I said, a vampire doesn't have to be dead, does it? A living person could have the habit. I've read that old people sometimes drink the blood of young people to stay young. You're right, Watson. One of these books mentions that legend. But are we going to take this seriously? This agency sticks to the real world. No ghosts allowed. I don't think we can take Mr. Ferguson very seriously. Maybe this note is from him, and will tell us what's bothering him. He picked up another letter that had been lying on the table while he was reading the first one. He started to read with a smile, but his smile faded quickly, replaced by an intense look of interest. He finished the letter and sat there, thinking, for a while, the letter in his hand. Then he suddenly sat up. Cheeseman's Lamberley. Where is Lamberley, Watson? It's in Sussex, south of Horsham. Not too far then? And Cheeseman's? I know that area, Holmes. It's full of old houses named after the people who built them centuries ago. You get Audleys, Harveys, Carritons. The people are gone, but their names live on in their houses. Exactly, said Holmes coldly. He was a proud, reserved man who always remembered new information quickly, but rarely thanked anyone for sharing it. I think we'll learn a lot more about Cheeseman's Lamberley before we're done. This letter is from Robert Ferguson, just as I thought. By the way, he knows you. He knows me? You should read it. He handed me the letter. It had the same address as the other one. Dear Mr. Holmes, it said, my lawyers told me to contact you, but this is a very delicate matter, very difficult to talk about. It's about a friend of mine. He got married 5 years ago to a Peruvian woman, the daughter of a merchant. He met her when he was importing nitrates. She was beautiful, but being from a different country and having a different religion meant they didn't always get along. Maybe his feelings cooled, and he started to think the marriage was a mistake. He felt there were parts of her he could never understand. This was hard because she was a loving wife, devoted in every way, at least on the surface. Now, for the part I'll explain better when we meet. This note is just to give you the general idea, to see if you're interested. My friend's wife started acting strangely, completely unlike her normal, sweet and gentle self. He had been married twice before, and had a son from his first wife. This boy was 15, a lovely and affectionate lad, but he'd been injured in an accident when he was young. Twice the wife was caught attacking the poor boy for no reason. Once, she hit him with a stick and left a big bruise on his arm. This was nothing compared to what she did to her own child, a baby boy, just under a year old. About a month ago, the baby's nurse left him alone for a few minutes. He started crying loudly, like he was in pain. The nurse ran back in and saw the lady leaning over the baby, biting his neck. There was a small wound on his neck, bleeding. The nurse was terrified and wanted to call the husband, but the lady begged her not to, and gave her £5 to keep quiet. She never explained what happened, and everyone just forgot about it. But it really scared the nurse. From then on, she watched her mistress carefully and kept a close eye on the baby, who she loved dearly. It seemed to her that the mother was watching her too, waiting for any chance to be alone with the baby. Day and night, the nurse kept the baby safe, and day and night, the silent, watchful mother seemed to be lying in wait, like a wolf watching a lamb. It probably sounds unbelievable to you, but I beg you to take it seriously, because a child's life and a man's sanity might depend on it. Finally, one horrible day, the husband couldn't ignore what was happening. The nurse couldn't take it anymore, and she told the husband everything. To him, it sounded just as crazy as it probably sounds to you. He knew his wife was a loving wife, and apart from attacking her stepson, a loving mother. So why would she hurt her own baby? He told the nurse she was dreaming, that she was crazy, that she was lying about her mistress. While they were talking, they heard a sudden cry of pain. The nurse and the husband rushed to the nursery. Imagine how he felt, Mr. Holmes, when he saw his wife standing over the cot, blood on the baby's neck and on the sheet. He turned his wife's face to the light and saw blood around her lips. It was her, no doubt about it. She had drunk the baby's blood. That's where we are now. She's locked in her room. No explanation. The husband is almost out of his mind. He and I only know about vampirism by name. We thought it was a wild story from foreign lands. But here, in the very heart of English Sussex, well, we can talk about all this tomorrow. Will you see me? Will you use your great powers to help a desperate man? If so, please send a telegram to Ferguson, Cheesemans, Lamberley, and I'll be at your rooms by 10 o'clock. Yours faithfully, Robert Ferguson. P.S. I think your friend Watson played rugby for Blackheath when I was 3/4 for Richmond. It's the only connection I can make. Of course I remember him, I said, putting the letter down. Big Bob Ferguson, the best 3/4 Richmond ever had. He was always a good guy. It's typical of him to be so worried about a friend. Holmes looked at me thoughtfully and shook his head. I never quite understand your limits, Watson, Holmes said with a smile. You're full of surprises. Send a telegram, like a good chap. Something like, we'll examine your case with pleasure. My case? I exclaimed. We can't let him think this agency is for the faint of heart. Of course it's his case. Send the telegram, and we'll wait until morning. Promptly at 10 o'clock the next morning, Ferguson walked into our room. I remembered him as a tall, sturdy man with long limbs and a lot of energy, who had run circles around many an opponent on the rugby field. There's nothing sadder than seeing a great athlete like that broken down. He was much thinner now, his blonde hair was thinning, and his shoulders were slumped. I think I mirrored his feelings. "Hello, Watson," he said, his voice still deep and strong. "You don't look quite the same since I sent you flying into the crowd at the old deer park. I've changed a bit too, but it's these last few days that have aged me. I see from your telegram, Mr. Holmes, that there's no point in pretending I'm someone else's deputy. It's simpler to deal directly, Holmes said. Of course it is. But you can imagine how hard it is when you're talking about the one woman you're supposed to protect and help. What can I do? How can I go to the police with this story? And the children need protecting. Is it madness, Mr. Holmes? Is it something in the blood? Have you ever seen anything like this? Please give me some advice. I don't know what to do. I understand, Mr. Ferguson. Now calm down, sit here, and answer a few questions clearly. I can assure you I'm far from helpless, and I'm confident we'll find a solution. First, tell me what you've done so far. Is your wife still near the children? We had a terrible scene. She's a loving woman, Mr. Holmes. If any woman ever loved a man with all her heart and soul, it's her. She was heartbroken that I found out this horrible, unbelievable secret. She wouldn't even talk. She didn't answer my accusations, just looked at me with a wild, desperate look in her eyes. Then she rushed to her room and locked herself in. Since then, she won't see me. She has a maid who worked for her before she got married, Dolores, more like a friend than a servant. She takes her food to her. So, the child isn't in immediate danger? Mrs. Mason, the nurse, has sworn she won't leave him alone, day or night. I trust her completely. I'm more worried about poor little Jack because, like I said in my note, she attacked him twice. But she never hurt him? No, she hit him hard. It's worse, because he's such a sweet, harmless little boy. Ferguson's face softened when he talked about his son. You'd think his condition would soften anyone's heart. He fell when he was little and has a twisted spine, Mr. Holmes, but he has the sweetest, most loving heart in the world. Holmes picked up the letter from the day before and read it again. What other people live in your house, Mr. Ferguson? 2 servants who haven't been working for us very long. A stable hand, Michael, who sleeps in the house. My wife, myself. My boy, Jack. The baby, Dolores. And Mrs. Mason. That's it. I understand you didn't know your wife very well when you got married. I only knew her for a few weeks. How long has this maid Dolores worked for her? For a few years. So your wife's character would be better known to Dolores than to you? Yes, you could say that. Holmes made a note. I think, he said, that I'll be more helpful at Lamberley than here. This case needs personal investigation. If the lady stays in her room, our presence won't bother her. We'd stay at the inn, of course. Ferguson looked relieved. That's what I hoped, Mr. Holmes. There's a good train at 2 from Victoria if you could come. Of course we can come. Things are quiet right now. I can give you my full attention. Watson is coming with us, of course. But there are a couple of things I need to be absolutely sure of before we go. As I understand it, this unfortunate lady seems to have attacked both children, your own baby and your little son. That's right. But the attacks were different, weren't they? She beat your son. Once with a stick and once with her hands, very hard. Did she give any explanation for hitting him? None, except that she hated him. She said it over and over again. Well, that's not unusual with stepmothers. We'll call it posthumous jealousy, perhaps. Is the lady jealous by nature? Yes, she's very jealous. Jealous with all the passion of her fiery tropical love. But the boy, he's 15, I understand, and probably very intelligent, even though he can't move around as easily. Did he give you any explanation for these attacks? No, he said there was no reason. Were they friends at other times? No, they never liked each other. But you say he's affectionate? He's the most devoted son you could imagine. My life is his life. He's completely focused on what I say and do." Holmes made another note. He sat there thinking for a while. "I imagine you and the boy were very close before your second marriage. You were thrown together a lot, weren't you?" "Very much so." "And the boy, being so affectionate, was probably very devoted to the memory of his mother?" "Absolutely devoted." "He certainly seems to be a fascinating lad. There's one more thing about these attacks. Were the strange attacks on the baby and the attacks on your son happening at the same time?" "In the first case, yes. It was like she was suddenly possessed by some kind of frenzy and took her anger out on both of them. In the second case, only Jack was hurt. Mrs. Mason didn't complain about the baby." "That certainly makes things more complicated." "I don't quite understand, Mr. Holmes." "Maybe not. We make guesses and then wait for time or more information to prove them wrong. A bad habit, Mr. Ferguson, but human nature is weak. I'm afraid your old friend here has exaggerated my scientific methods a bit. But for now, I'll just say that your problem doesn't seem impossible to me, and you can expect to find us at Victoria at 2 o'clock. It was a dark and foggy November evening when we dropped off our bags at the Checkers Inn in Lamberley and drove down a long, winding road through the Sussex countryside. Finally, we reached the old farmhouse where Ferguson lived. It was a big, rambling place, very old in the middle, and newer on the sides, with tall Tudor chimneys and a roof made of old grey tiles. The steps were worn smooth, and the old tiles around the porch had a picture carved into them, a cheese and a man, after the person who built it a long time ago. Inside, the ceilings were made of thick, heavy wooden beams, and the uneven floors dipped and swerved. The whole building smelled old and a bit musty. There was one big central room where Ferguson led us. In the middle of the room, there was a giant, old-fashioned fireplace with an iron screen dated 1670. A big fire was roaring and crackling inside. The room was a strange mixture of different times and places. The walls were partly covered with old wooden panels, probably put there by the first farmer who lived in the house hundreds of years ago. But on the lower part of the walls, there were some modern paintings, nicely chosen. And above, where the walls were made of yellow plaster instead of wood, there were lots of things from South America, tools and weapons, probably brought by the Peruvian lady upstairs. Holmes jumped up, curious, and carefully looked at them. He came back with a thoughtful look on his face. "Hello?" he said. "Hello?" A spaniel was lying in a basket in the corner. It slowly came towards its owner, walking with difficulty. Its back legs moved unevenly, and its tail dragged on the floor. It licked Ferguson's hand. "What is it, Mr. Holmes?" "The dog. What's wrong with it?" That's what puzzled the vet. He thought it was a kind of paralysis, spinal meningitis. But it's getting better. He'll be fine soon, won't you, Carlo? The dog's tail gave a little twitch. Its sad eyes looked from one of us to the other. It knew we were talking about it. "Did it come on suddenly?" "In a single night." "How long ago?" "Maybe 4 months ago." "Very interesting. Very suggestive. What do you see in it, Mr. Holmes?" "It confirms what I already thought." "For heaven's sake, what do you think, Mr. Holmes? It might be a puzzle for you, but it's life or death for me. My wife could be a murderer. My child is in danger. Don't play games with me, Mr. Holmes. This is too serious." The big rugby player was trembling. Holmes put his hand on his arm to comfort him. "I'm afraid there's going to be some pain for you, Mr. Ferguson, no matter what the answer is," he said. "I'll try to make things easier for you. I can't say more right now, but before I leave this house, I hope I'll have some answers." "Please God you will. If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I'll go upstairs to see if my wife is any better." He was gone for a few minutes while Holmes looked at the interesting things on the wall again. When Ferguson came back, it was clear from his sad face that nothing had changed. He brought a tall, slim girl with brown skin. "Tea's ready, Dolores," Ferguson said. "Make sure your mistress has everything she needs." "She vera ill," the girl said, looking angrily at her master. "She no ask for food. She vera ill. She need doctor. I frightened stay alone with her without doctor." Ferguson looked at me, asking a question with his eyes. "I would be happy to help." "Would your mistress see Dr. Watson?" "I take him. I not ask permission. She need doctor." "Then I'll come with you right away." I followed the girl, who was shaking with strong emotions, up the stairs and down an old hallway. At the end of the hallway was a heavy wooden door with iron bands around it. I noticed that if Ferguson tried to force his way into his wife's room, it wouldn't be easy. The girl took a key from her pocket, and the old door creaked as she opened it. I went inside and she quickly closed the door behind her. A woman was lying in bed, obviously very sick with a fever. She was only half conscious, but as I went in, she opened her eyes, wide and scared, and stared at me with fear. When she saw a stranger, she seemed to relax and sighed as she lay back on the pillow. I went over to her, spoke a few calming words, and took her pulse and temperature. Both were high, but it seemed to me that she was more agitated and nervous than actually ill. "She lie like that 1 day, 2 day. I 'fraid she die," the girl said. The woman turned her flushed, beautiful face towards me. "Where is my husband?" "He's downstairs and wants to see you." "I will not see him. I will not see him." Then she seemed to start talking nonsense. "A fiend! A fiend! Oh, what shall I do with this devil?" "Can I help you in any way?" "No, no one can help. It's finished. Everything is destroyed. No matter what I do, it's destroyed." The woman must have some kind of strange delusion. I couldn't imagine honest Bob Ferguson as a fiend or a devil. "Madame," I said, "your husband loves you very much. He's very upset about what's happened." She looked at me again with those beautiful eyes. "He loves me. Yes. But don't I love him? Don't I love him so much that I would sacrifice myself rather than break his heart? That's how much I love him. And yet he could think of me. He could speak of me that way. He's full of grief, but he can't understand." "No, he can't understand, but he should trust." "Will you see him?" I asked. "No, no, I can't forget those terrible words, or the look on his face. I won't see him. Go now. You can't do anything for me. Tell him only one thing. I want my child. I have a right to my child. That's the only message I can send him." She turned her face to the wall and wouldn't say anything else. I went back downstairs to the room where Ferguson and Holmes were sitting by the fire. Ferguson listened gloomily as I told him about the visit. "How can I send her the child?" he asked. "How do I know what crazy thing she might do? How can I ever forget seeing her standing over him with his blood on her lips?" He shuddered at the memory. "The child is safe with Mrs. Mason, and that's where he'll stay." A smart maid, the only modern thing which we had seen in the house, had brought in some tea. As she was serving us, the door opened and a young man walked into the room. He was a remarkable boy, pale and blond, with bright blue eyes that lit up with excitement and joy when he saw his father. He rushed forward and threw his arms around his neck, like a loving girl. "Oh, Daddy," he cried, "I didn't know you were coming back yet. I should have been here to meet you. I'm so glad to see you." Ferguson gently pulled back, a little embarrassed. "My dear boy," he said, patting the boy's blond hair with a gentle hand, I came back early because my friends, Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, decided to come and spend the evening with us." "Is that Mr. Holmes, the detective?" "Yes." The boy looked at us with a sharp and, it seemed to me, unfriendly gaze. "What about your other child, Mr. Ferguson?" Holmes asked. "Would it be okay if we met the baby?" "Ask Mrs. Mason to bring the baby down," Ferguson said. The boy walked away with a strange, uneven way of walking that told me, as a doctor, that he had a weak spine. Soon he came back with a tall, thin woman carrying a beautiful little child in her arms. The baby had dark eyes and golden hair, a wonderful mix of English and South American. Ferguson clearly loved him because he took him in his arms and held him close. "It's hard to imagine anyone hurting him," he muttered, looking at the small red mark on the baby's neck. At that moment, I happened to look at Holmes and saw a very strange look on his face. He was very serious, like his face was carved from old ivory. His eyes had glanced at the father and child for a moment, but now they were looking with intense curiosity at something on the other side of the room. Following his gaze, I could only guess he was looking out the window at the melancholy dripping garden. It's true that a shutter was partly closed, blocking the view, but it was definitely the window that Holmes was staring at. Then he smiled, and his eyes went back to the baby. The baby had a small, puckered mark on his chubby neck. Without saying anything, Holmes carefully examined it. Finally, he shook one of the baby's small fists, which was waving in the air. "Goodbye, little man. You've had a strange start in life. Nurse, I need to talk to you privately." He took her aside and spoke seriously for a few minutes. I only heard the last words. "Your worries will soon be over, I hope." The woman, who seemed like a grumpy, quiet type, took the child and left. "What's Mrs. Mason like?" Holmes asked. "Not very attractive, as you can see, but she has a good heart and loves the child very much." "Do you like her, Jack?" Holmes suddenly turned to the boy. His expressive face clouded over and he shook his head. "Jackie is very picky about who he likes," Ferguson said, putting his arm around the boy. "Luckily, I'm one of the people he likes." The boy cooed and nestled his head against his father's chest. Ferguson gently pulled him away. "Run along, little Jackie," he said, and he watched his son with love until he disappeared. "Now, Mr. Holmes," he continued after the boy was gone, "I really feel like I've dragged you on a wild goose chase. What can you possibly do, except give me your sympathy? This must be a very difficult and complicated situation from your point of view." "It's definitely delicate," said my friend with a playful smile, "but I haven't been impressed by how complicated it is so far. It has been a case for intellectual deduction, but when this original intellectual deduction is confirmed by a number of different things, then the guess becomes a fact, and we can be sure we've found the answer. Actually, I had the answer before we left Baker Street, and the rest has just been watching and confirming it." Ferguson put his big hand to his furrowed forehead. "For heaven's sake, Holmes," he said, his voice rough, "if you know what's really going on, please don't keep me in suspense. What's happening? What should I do? I don't care how you found out the truth, as long as you know it. Of course, I owe you an explanation, and you'll get one. But will you let me handle things my way? Is the lady well enough to see us, Watson?" "She is ill, but she is quite rational." "Very good. We can only clear things up if she's there. Let's go see her." "She won't see me," Ferguson cried. "Oh yes, she will," Holmes said. He wrote a few words on a piece of paper. "At least you have the key, Watson. Would you be so kind as to give this note to the lady?" I went back upstairs and gave the note to Dolores, who carefully opened the door. A minute later, I heard a cry from inside. a cry that seemed to be full of joy and surprise. Dolores looked out. "She will see them. She will listen," Dolores said. At my call, Ferguson and Holmes came upstairs. As we entered the room, Ferguson took a couple of steps toward his wife, who had sat up in bed, but she held out her hand to stop him. He sat down in an armchair, while Holmes sat beside him, bowing to the lady, who looked at him with wide, surprised eyes. "I think we can do without Dolores," Holmes said. "Oh, very well, madam. If you prefer her to stay, I have no problem with that. Now, Mr. Ferguson, I am a busy man with many calls, and my methods have to be short and direct. The swiftest surgery is the least painful. Let me first say what will ease your mind. Your wife is a very good, very loving, and very mistreated woman." Ferguson sat up with a cry of joy. "Prove that, Mr. Holmes, and I'll be forever in your debt." "I will, but in doing so, I'll have to hurt you deeply in another way." "I don't care, as long as you clear my wife's name. Everything else in the world is nothing compared to that." Let me tell you, then, how I figured things out back in Baker Street. The idea of a vampire was ridiculous to me. Things like that don't happen in England, but what you saw was real. You saw the lady standing over the child's cot with blood on her lips. I did. Didn't it cross your mind that a bleeding wound might be sucked for a reason other than to drain the blood? Wasn't there a queen in English history who sucked a wound to draw poison out of it? Poison! A South American household. My gut feeling told me those weapons were on the wall before I even saw them. It might have been a different poison, but that's what came to mind. When I saw that small, empty quiver next to the little bow and arrow, it was exactly what I expected. If the child had been pricked with one of those arrows dipped in curare or some other dangerous drug, it would have meant death if the poison wasn't sucked out. And the dog! If someone was using a poison like that, wouldn't they try it first, to make sure it still worked? I didn't expect to see the dog, but at least I understood what was wrong with him, and he fit into my explanation. Now, do you understand? Your wife was afraid of this attack. She saw it happen and saved the child's life. But she was afraid to tell you the truth, because she knew how much you loved the boy and was worried it would break your heart. Jackie! I was watching him when you were holding the baby. His face was clearly reflected in the window glass where the shutter was blocking part of the view. I saw such jealousy, such cruel hatred, as I've rarely seen in a person. My Jackie, you have to face it, Mr. Ferguson. It's even worse, because it's a twisted kind of love, a crazy, exaggerated love for you, and maybe for his dead mother, that made him do this. His whole soul is filled with hatred for this healthy, beautiful child, who's so different from him because he's weak. Good heavens, it's unbelievable. Have I told the truth, madam? The lady was sobbing, her face buried in the pillow. Now she turned to her husband. How could I tell you, Bob? I knew how much it would hurt you. It was better to wait and have someone else tell you than to tell you myself. When this gentleman, who seems to have magical powers, wrote that he knew everything, I was relieved. I think a year at sea would be my prescription for Master Jackie, Holmes said, standing up. There's only one thing that's still unclear, madam. We understand why you attacked Master Jackie. There is a limit to a mother's patience. But how could you leave the child alone for the last 2 days? I told Mrs. Mason. She knew. Exactly. That's what I thought. Ferguson was standing by the bed, choking, his hands stretched out and shaking. I think it's time for us to leave, Watson, Holmes said in a whisper. If you'll take one arm of the very devoted Dolores, I'll take the other. There, he said, closing the door behind him. I think we may leave them to settle the rest among themselves. I only have one more note about this case. It's the letter that Holmes wrote in reply to the one that started the story. Here it is. Baker Street, Nova 21st, Re-Vampires. Sir, referring to your letter of the 19th, I would like to say that I have looked into the matter concerning your client, Mr. Robert Ferguson, of Ferguson and Muirhead, tea brokers, of Mincing Lane, and that the situation has been resolved satisfactorily. Thank you for your recommendation. I am, sir, faithfully yours, Sherlock Holmes. The end. If you like the story, hit that like button and subscribe for more videos. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Was there anything that surprised you? Who's your favorite character in the story? I can't wait to hear your thoughts.